Morning, folks. Welcome to Strenuous Conversations. You may notice something a little bit different about this this morning. I busted out a little 24-kilo kettlebell. There's a reason for that. The reason is it's Thursday, the day after Ash Wednesday. So right on Thursday, I have a high rep snatch workout scheduled, meaning I do kettlebell snatches. But also yesterday was a fast day, which means I ate a little less than half of what the calories I usually eat. So yeah, may get a little bit strenuous as I get into it. 70-pound snatches are tough at the best of time. Right now I'm still rehabbing this elbow joint injury. Baby boy kept waking us up all night long, and it was a fast day yesterday, so I may run out of steam somewhere in the middle of it. So that's why I have my trusty 24 kilo standing by just in case things get a little hairy and I have to drop the weight. So today we are discussing, I want to go back and revisit a couple of key verses in the final section or the second to last section of the Hound of Heaven. In going over the poems, the part of the poem that I talked about in the last episode, there was a verse that I missed. And it's easy to miss verses in that section of the poem because, like I said, he goes from image to image, and there's not a direct flow from one image to the next. They don't naturally fit in from one to the next. So it's easy to miss one. So when I was thinking about it, I realized it's actually, I was thinking of it as something that didn't really matter. It's kind of a throwaway image. It's only 2 lines. But I found myself at the end of this section wanting to go really in depth on the last line of the poem, of that section, and realizing that the line that I skipped and the lines that I wanted to go in depth on were all on the same theme. So we'll go back and look at them a little bit. The line that I skipped was, must, designer infinite, must thou char the wood ere thou canst live with it. And it comes right after, is thy love indeed a weed, albeit an amaranthine weed, suffering no flowers except its own to mount. He's complaining to God. He's asking, if I give in and I let you love me and I let myself love you the way you deserve, am I going to have anything else? Is there room for any other loves in my life? But when he comes to this question about must thou char the wood, he prefaces it with must designer infinite. To my hasty recollection, I'm scanning the poem in my head right now. I think it's the only point in the poem where he directly addresses God by a title. That was the shortest minute ever. The title that he chooses is Designer Infinite. Why? Well, what's his question? His question is, must thou char the wood ere thou canst limn with it? Limn means to draw or to write. In the old days, they would sketch with burnt sticks. They'd char the end of it to make a little charcoal point on it, and then they'd use that for sketching. This is gonna suck. Anyway. 2 rounds into it, can't quit now. Okay, so. The question that he's asking is, Designer Infinite. You are all powerful, you're all knowing, you're all wise. Must thou char the wood ere thou canst limn with it? Why, if you're so smart, why is it that you can't figure out how to get writing out of a piece of wood without burning it? And that resonates with a question that he asks later on in the section. Where he is almost at the very end, the second to last line. Son of a gun. See if I can bring that line to mind now. Getting a little smoked. My brain is tired. His name I know, and what his trumpet saith. Whether man's life or heart it be which yields thee harvest, must thy harvest fields be dunged by rotten death. Again. We know God, that you are bringing something wonderful out of all of this, that you are going to get a great harvest, that you're going to have an amazing sketch, but at what cost? And here, Thompson is echoing one of the, in fact, the only argument against the Christian vision of God that's ever made any intellectual sense to me. Pretty much all the other arguments against, they're purely intellectual, at least on the surface, and they're subject to purely intellectual rebuttals. Without getting too far into it, I think it's safe to say that the existence of God, as Christians conceive of him, is one of the more solid intellectual propositions the world has ever seen. But there's the problem, the question. C.S. Lewis wrote of it under the title, The Problem of Pain. And it is this problem. If God, as Christians say, is all good and all loving, why is there still suffering? I mean, think about it. We say God is all-powerful, meaning he can do anything he wants. We say God is all-loving, meaning he wants what is good. So why do bad things happen? The answer is either God does not love, and so doesn't care whether we suffer, or God is not all powerful, meaning he cares, but he can't do anything about it. And all attempts to resolve this difficulty logically, on a purely rational basis, they have a tendency to stupid left arm. They have a tendency to dissolve into one or the other of those two heresies. God allows suffering because he doesn't care, or God allows suffering because he can't do anything about it. Now, I will say that, generally speaking, this is a bias that I've formed over the years, is that this argument, this objection to the existence of God, comes mostly from academic circles. You don't see it so much in people who merely suffer. You see it in people who think about suffering, whether or not they have suffered. So, this priest Beltran, what was his first name? I think it was Thomas Beltran, a Filipino priest from a fairly rich family in the Philippines. He chose as his first assignment Smoky Mountain, which is a dump in Manila, the world's largest landfill. because he wanted to see what, he wanted to bring peace and bring hope to the suffering. And what he found was that they brought hope to him. He thought he was going to have to go in and help them to reconcile the idea of the faith with their suffering, but that wasn't what they wanted from him. They wanted him to be a priest. They wanted him to administer the sacraments, preach the gospel, and that was that. We see this again in the Middle Ages. Well, we'll look at it a little bit later. The Enlightenment. Probably have to go even later on. The postmodern, the modernists. The end of circa the First World War. They began really pushing this idea of a God who doesn't care or is ineffectual because of all the suffering. And this made sense to some who had just seen the people drowning in the mud and strangled by concertina wire, held in place while bullets and shells tore them apart, entrails draped across tent posts, and all the horrors of that war. And above all, the senseless banality of the violence. The whole war was a comedy of errors. Without the comedy, it need not have happened. So a number of intellectuals, T.S. Eliot, Virginia Woolf, Ezra Pound, a whole bunch of people in that circle, jumped on this bandwagon of there is no God. If there were, he would never have allowed this evil. But what's interesting about it is that the intellectuals at the birth of this modernist movement mostly didn't go to the war. They spent a good time, a deal of time thinking about suffering, but they were not the ones actually suffering. And even that, they did in an ahistorical fashion. They didn't think historically about the problem of suffering. So the great 20th century English apologists and Catholic writers, Tolkien, Lewis, some of the others in the Inklings, they actually did go to the war. They actually did slog their way through the trenches and get shot at. Tolkien had such severe trench fever that he missed, I want to say it was the Somme, but he missed a great battle where most of his friends from college were all killed. And that kind of thing leaves a mark. But these people, through their experience of suffering, did not see a reason to question the existence, the benevolence, or the power of God. Rather, it was faith in these things that gave them courage through this suffering. We find something similar. Let's go back now to the Middle Ages. The modernists, thinking about the problem of suffering, acted as if suffering was something that had been invented in the 20th century. When in fact, suffering has been the lot of mankind since the very beginning. As far back as human history goes, we find suffering. And this is especially true of Christianity, which was born out of suffering. Starting to run out of steam. I mean, the symbol of Christianity is an implement of torture. That's what the cross was. The first centuries of Christianity were marked by persecution and suffering. How many Christians were killed in the first centuries of the church? First 3 centuries. So suffering was something that has been with Christianity since the very beginning. And this did not change in the golden age of Christianity, so-called, when all of Europe was Christian. In the Middle Ages, death by Viking, death by bandit, death by raider, all kinds of violent deaths, torture, rape, these were, if not everyday occurrences, they certainly were something that the average person would experience at least a few times in their lives. Disease. Talk about the plague ravaging London every summer. A third of the population of Europe died. Did it create a crisis of faith? You could argue that the Protestant Reformation indirectly rose from it. But what it did not do was inspire a broad intellectual movement denying the existence of God, or claiming that God was not God. So this brings us back to the poem where Thompson is both a sufferer and an intellectual. I have to block that hand now. So another place I don't hear this existence of God argument is at the jail. Or among the homeless or the drug addicts. Some of them, it's true, don't believe in God. But to grossly overgeneralize, I think it's less common than it is in the more civilized areas of our society. So the people at the jail, I will often find faith of a degree that is simply astounding. People who absolutely 100% believe in God. They believe that He loves them and that He's their only hope. A lot of the faith is riddled with superstition, and a lot of it is colored by shame. They find it much easier to believe in a God who lets them suffer because they deserve it. So this sounds shocking, but let me try to piece that together for you a little bit. So someone who's been abandoned by society, looked down on by society, told that they're worthless, not necessarily in words, though very often in words, but by all of their interactions with the crowd of humanity. Begins to internalize that message. I am shameful, I am worthless. Therefore, why shouldn't God turn His back on me? Everyone else has. I find this fairly easy to sympathize with. We talked earlier, in an earlier episode, about Thompson's experience of shame. The bias I'll usually see is that the people who seriously put forward the argument from suffering mostly draw it from an experience of thinking about suffering, intellectualizing about suffering. The people who merely suffer, they don't overanalyze it. They merely suffer it. They tend to have less resistance to the idea of a mysterious God. And even my folks in the jail who have that attitude, everybody else has turned their back on me, why shouldn't God? They tend not to rationalize or intellectualize, most of them, their suffering. It's just there. They blame whoever they blame, society, their parents, their recruiting sergeant, whoever. Some of them blame God But most do not. Before they blame God, they blame themselves. And they turn to God as their one hope for redemption. And Thompson is living in both worlds. He's both a sufferer and an intellectual. He both suffers his suffering and he thinks about his suffering. And as often as not, tries not to think about his suffering by numbing it with his drugs. But Thompson, for whatever reason, doesn't end up on the intellectual side of the curtain. That was a smoker. Okay. He does not attempt to put forward a rationalization of the existence of God, the benevolence of God, or the omnipotence of God. He is writing a poem. He's sharing his experience in a poem and not arguing about it. He makes sense of it by sharing it. So he throws in these lines. He doesn't throw them in. He carefully places these lines in there. Must designer infinite, must thou char the wood ere thou canst limn with it. Whether man's life or heart it be which yields thee harvest, must thy harvest fields be dunged by rotten death? And he finishes the section there. He doesn't, as with the other sections, he closed them out with this. He closed them out with this motif of still with unhurrying chase and unperturbed pace, deliberate speed, majestic instancy. He closes the previous three sections with this motif of the pursuit. But this section, after he asks this question, must thy harvest fields be dunged by rotten death? He lets it hang. He doesn't close out this section. And somewhere there in the silence at the end of this section, in the silence between asking the question and receiving such an answer as there is, it's in that silence, I think, that he finds his answer, not in an intellectual aphorism or a proposition, or he doesn't come up with a mathematical formula to square the circle. What he does is he receives the answer as a person. The answer is a person. But that's for the final section of the poem, which we'll get into next week. For now, hold on to that impression, the idea, that experience. Whether man's life or heart it be which yields thee harvest, must thy harvest fields be dunged with rotten death?